Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
My name is Russell Brooks. Tonight's program focuses on a national think tank and advocacy organization called Third Way. Third Way champions moderate policy and political ideas. The organization pushes for reform-oriented politics that can deliver electoral power and drive meaningful policy change. Joining me to describe the purpose of Third Way in greater detail is the Senior Director of Communications, Kate deGruyter. Kate, welcome to Inside Scoop.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Now, I briefly described how Third Way describes itself. How does Third Way describe our two major political parties?
Well, there are two major political parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. We see the Democratic Party as the vehicle for change. We see a greater opportunity in the center left to try and build a common sense consensus among a universe of moderate and independent voters. We focus on those places and those voters because that is where electoral majorities are built and where governing mandates are delivered. And so we have a real expertise in how you win and the types of issues that are important to the people in the battleground states and districts that both parties are fighting over each cycle.
Mm-hmm. You formerly worked on Capitol Hill. Did your experience on the Hill prod you to maybe seek a different approach to solving our major issues?
I had the pleasure and the privilege of working for a congressman on the House side who was deeply involved in trying to pass a bipartisan immigration bill. And I got to see behind the scenes the really thorny challenge of trying to build consensus on one of the most contentious issues of the day. And so the opportunity to move over to a think tank where we are trying to figure out how we build out that common ground in the middle felt like a natural extension of that work. Unfortunately, the House was unable to come to an agreement. The congressman that I work for had a bipartisan bill that they were preparing to present to then Speaker John Boehner to try and get his support to put the bill to a vote on the House floor. And that night here in Virginia, Dave Bratt defeated Eric Cantor in a primary, and that really shook the Republican majority, and the prospect of taking some tough votes on an issue like this that would upset the Tea Party base meant that it was no longer going to move forward. And so figuring out how we build out that common ground to try and finally tackle what I think everybody agrees is a pretty poorly functioning immigration system, as well as a whole bunch of other issues, was an attractive opportunity for me.
The New York Times describes Third Way as radical centrist. Is there a place in the American political spectrum for radical centrists?
Absolutely, and I think we need a lot more of that in this moment. What we saw in the last election is that the country actually moved to the right in a number of noticeable ways. And so thinking about what does it look like for Democrats to talk to understand the concerns of working Americans, the party lost all 7 of the battleground states, albeit not by much, but the outcome was a pretty significant disappointment to everybody, regardless of their ideological orientation within the party, and we've got to do some real soul searching about how we rebuild trust with voters. And a little bit of radical centrism, having some fight, having some deep ideas about how we reform government, how we make it work in a functional, modern way that's respectful of people's time and their expectations for high service is a calling that we should all be working towards.
Mm-hmm. Is there a current American politician that represents Third Way's conception of radical centrist? And if not, who comes closest?
Well, I think there's a whole bunch of folks that I would say embody that. We work very closely with a lot of the moderate Democrats across Capitol Hill. Many of them are known as part of the New Democrat Coalition. There's over 100 of them. There's also some of the more conservative members of the Blue Dog Coalition in the House, folks who are thinking really creatively about how Democrats win in some pretty purple and even red places. And there's also a whole bunch of folks in the Senate that are going to have to run and win in statewide races in places that have gotten much redder. Some of the best data coming out of the election shows that had a lot of the people who stayed on the couch actually come out to vote, Democrats would have lost by about 4 more points. And that's a flip. Democrats used to pride ourselves that we were the party of the people and that high turnout elections were good for our party. This is the first time we've seen that that's no longer true. And so we really have some urgency to reconnect. And I think there are a lot of folks looking at how they reconnect with the center of the American public. We're seeing a lot of candidates talk about that. Exactly who emerges as a front runner is going to be something that we'll be tracking very closely.
Mm-hmm. So no one is quite there yet.
Well, I think that there are a lot of folks that show real promise. I am very interested in some of the comments that I've seen recently from Maryland's governor, Wes Moore. I think he's a very charismatic figure. I think that there's an opportunity to rebuild and talk in a way that really reconnects with people. And I think he's one that has shown an aperture to go into different conversations. I've heard him talking about, getting into sports and, there's been a lot of conversation about how Democrats have not been in spaces where a lot of male voters have been. And so somebody like that who could speak to voters could be attractive, but there's a whole bunch of folks that I think will be interesting. Governor Josh Shapiro is another who's known for his moderate credentials. He's done a lot of interesting work in Pennsylvania, most notably opening up state government for people without a college degree. And that is a population that Democrats are really obsessing over. We pride ourselves on being the party of the working class, but working Americans didn't completely agree with us this election, and so we've got work to do there. He's another interesting figure to watch, but I expect that we'll have dozens of Democrats vying for the nomination.
Okay. Now, didn't the Democratic Leadership Council represent this sort of approach during the 90s as it propelled Bill Clinton onto the national scene?
They did. They had a declaration that they put out. And they had a number of different folks, and they were very fortunate that one of their chairs was the governor from Arkansas who went on to win the nomination and then the White House. I think that there's a lot of interest in thinking about how Democrats reconnect in the way that Bill Clinton was so talented at doing. He was plain spoken. He was very savvy about understanding where people were at, and I think that we're going to need some more of that.
Mm-hmm. So I have to ask then, because the DLC faded away and more progressive politics in the Democratic Party took hold. Are we just witnessing a return to the DLC approach, but with a different moniker?
Well, I think that this is a new moment, and so Democrats have to have an eye to the future. I think there's a lot that we can learn about what has worked effectively in the past, but I think we also need an affirmative vision for a government that is equipped for the age of AI, a government that delivers services where we are efficient about helping somebody register for a business. How do we help do it online? How do we make government a better experience for voters who are interacting with it in a whole bunch of different ways? I think that there's a lot to talk about in the reform space. There's been a lot of columns noting how difficult it is to build things in America, and there's a lot of the Democratic agenda that rests, climate work and infrastructure are 2 examples, on being able to build out clean energy infrastructure. And there's been a logjam in our ability to build things in this country where costs balloon and timelines lengthen, and voters don't actually see anything for all of that effort. And so I think we need to have more urgency about how we are thinking about confronting those obstacles where they exist, even within government, and Democrats should be thinking hard about the ideas that they can offer voters.
Mm-hmm. Third Way focuses on 7 programmatic or policy areas: climate and energy, economy, education, healthcare, national security, politics, and social policy. Why were those 7 chosen?
Well, I think that we started out in the social policy space. We actually started as a gun safety organization back in the day. Our former founder, or our current founders, were deeply passionate about that issue, and it was a space where there was a real need back in 2005 when we were founded to build out space to help Democrats in red states in particular learn how to speak to voters on that contentious issue. Now, we've come a very long way, and the consensus has grown around a whole bunch of very sensible things that we can do to protect the Second Amendment, as well as have responsibilities that are appropriate safeguards to prevent some of the worst excesses that we've seen of an epidemic of gun violence. I'm part of the generation that grew up with a lot of school shootings, and now my kids are going to live in that. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that space, but obviously the economy, a sense of safety and security are deep parts of the American psyche. Democrats need to have clear answers about that. And as we move into a new era of global competition and the race to secure a digital democracy and set the rules of engagement in new spaces, there's a lot of important work to be done. And so we've adapted where we see that we have a unique value add that we can bring, where we've got the passion to tackle an issue well, and where somebody else in the space isn't already doing the work that needs to be done. And so we can be really strategic in where we weigh in.
Okay, very interesting. Traditionally, another area where Democrats have had some difficulty, but traditionally also Democrats have managed to find some middle ground, is national security. I say that because I'm old enough to remember the Henry Scoop Jackson type Democrats who were very, anti-Soviet Union, for a strong defense, but nevertheless were considered to be Democrats in good standing. Is Third Way hoping to revive that sort of approach to national security within the Democratic Party?
We've long advocated that Democrats need to be tough and smart on national security, and there's a temptation for Democrats, I think, to pivot to conversations where some of them feel much safer, talking about gun violence or other things. And when somebody is concerned about their safety, they want to hear a clear answer about that. And so the good news is that there's been a whole bunch of Democrats that represent a new generation of leaders who come out of national security backgrounds. Certainly the candidate for governor here in Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, is one of them, but Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan and Mikey Sherrill from New Jersey are others to watch.
Okay. We're going to have to pause for a short break, but please stay with us when we return with our guests for more of this very interesting show on Inside Scoop.
Nice going, Spencer! I can't believe we broke Old Man Hennessy's window.
Correction, dude. You broke. I just threw the ball.
This is really bad. What are we gonna do?
We?
Go to the door, ask for the ball back. Are you serious?
It's my ball, Myrtleback.
You're so dead. I'd run away.
Yeah, to Uruguay.
Kiss your life goodbye. Sorry.
Let's go. See you, dude. Yeah, you got me and you're well.
Nice one. Some friends you are.
Keep smiling, keep shining.
Hi. Tell him it was an accident,
On me.
and we can fix the window.
For sure.
Come on. I'll come with you.
Loyalty. Pass it on.
You go first.
A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about freaked out life. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Yeah.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Awkward. I'm the awkward silence. You try to avoid me, then there I am again.
But an awkward silence can be a great thing.
Like Kelly here is about to demonstrate.
You haven't really been yourself lately. Are you okay?
Find out how you can help a friend with their mental health at seizetheawkward.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop Scoop. Here again, your host.
Hi, I'm Russell Brooks, joined by my guest, Kate deGruyter from Third Way. Let's continue. We talked a little bit about the 7 programmatic areas for Third Way, but some of today's hot button issues may not be addressed within that mix, may or may not. Let's see. For instance, immigration and border control. What is the Third Way viewpoint on that hot button issue?
Yeah, we think that this is an area where Democrats need to really rebuild trust with the public. It's clear that voters were very dissatisfied with the sense of chaos that they had seen at the border for far too long. We have been pushing Democrats for quite some time that they need to get in front of this issue, show that they hear and that they are taking those concerns seriously, and champion a fair and orderly immigration system. And so we were proud to endorse and support the strictest bipartisan agreement that we've seen in a long time to try and build some consensus that would address and devote resources to the border, and recognize that, frankly, our asylum system, which is a deep part of the foundation of this country, needs to reflect an evolving sense of migration in this day and age. We want it to be fast, fair, and final. It is simply too long for people to have their claims heard. And what we've seen is that people have a sense that there isn't a sense that Democrats are willing to stand up and have a clear plan to solve the problem. So I think what you're seeing is, some folks leading forward. Senator Ruben Gallego is one who just recently offered a plan to do much of what we would argue, and he's been a leading voice in the party saying that we need to take the concerns of voters, including voters on the border, seriously, and offer a plan that is thoughtful, that maintains our values and principles as a nation of immigrants, but that also meets our obligation to our citizens to have a border that is secure and a process that voters feel confident is fast, fair, and efficient.
Another issue that receives considerable attention these days, especially due to the early actions by the Trump administration, is DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is Third Way's take on that issue?
Well, obviously, we think that it's very important that Democrats are speaking to a whole variety of people from a lot of different backgrounds. I think there's been a lot of focus on race in particular as a part of that conversation. We value and respect having people from a diversity of backgrounds, but we can think even more broadly about that. Obviously, we want to be inclusive so that we are fair and welcoming to applicants and people of a variety of different backgrounds, but we can also think about gender and about educational diversity and a whole bunch of different attributes to ensure that we are hearing a lot of different voices in the policymaking process, and that it reflects the will of the people as best as we can. And so I think it's clear that voters felt like Democrats got a little too focused on kind of the buzzwords of DEI. And so I think having the right spirit of wanting to hear and be thinking clearly about how we are inclusive of a whole variety of different positions is important. But we also need to make sure that we're not getting into kind of crazy territory in the way that we talk about inclusivity and how we are adapting our policies.
Okay. So Third Way certainly would not be an advocate for what has been criticized as the cancel culture, where at least certain voices were not deemed to be appropriate in today's society.
Yeah, I think that hasn't served Democrats well. I think there are a whole lot of voters who felt like things moved to a place where the language was changing constantly, the blowback was severe, and we weren't getting to a better outcome in the process. And so I think there's an opportunity for a reset. I think we can do so in a way that protects our values, but frankly, Democrats need to expand our coalition. We need to show that we are hearing the concerns of voters, that we understand their priorities, and I think that there were a lot of folks who felt like that was not the top priority that they were facing, and that Those were conversations that Democrats were having. Famously at the DNC, there was a lot of talk about just the right particular gender balance on a particular committee, and it sort of felt like a conversation in a faculty lounge and not the kind of thing that people who are working for a living, that are just trying to take their kids to extracurricular activities, could relate to. And so I think there's an appropriate moment to reconnect and recognize where maybe good intentions brought us to an unhelpful place.
Okay. Similarly, what is the third way position on reproductive rights? Was it a mistake for the Democratic Party to put so much in that particular basket following the Dobbs decision? Initially, it seemed like it was going to pay off quite well, but maybe in the end, it wasn't quite as effective as Democrats wished it would have been.
Yeah, I think that there were pretty high expectations that that was going to be a conversation that moved a lot of voters. And I saw a chart recently, and it had quadrants and noted where voters were on a particular issue and how they related it in its level of importance and which party they trusted more. And abortion, to the surprise, I think, of a lot of people, rated as something that they trusted Democrats more on, but that voters said was not super important. And I think in a post-Dobbs era, that was disappointing to many. I think this is part of where, we can talk about a whole bunch of different issues in a way that welcomes people to our coalition. We saw a lot about attacks on health. That is certainly still an issue where Democrats are strong. I think that there's a lot of anxiety about how some of the Republican Party's views could restrict some of these freedoms that a lot of people, women and men, care deeply about in this country. And I know that a lot of Democrats are going to continue to fight for reproductive choice. But there are a whole bunch of folks that we can have in our coalition who might not agree with every piece of that, and we want to make a space where we are expanding the tent as well.
Okay. Well, when we speak about trans issues, that seems to be especially challenging for the Democratic coalition.
It is.
We have congressmen who have taken varying points of view about whether trans athletes should compete in girls' athletics. And of course, we have the debate over what bathrooms people should use. How is the Democratic Party handling this from the third way standpoint? What should it be doing? What should it be saying with regard to trans rights?
We actually just wrote an article on this in Politico magazine last week. We feel like Democrats lost the center on this issue. There was a lot of recognition. The Trump team exploited this conversation to really reinforce to voters that Democrats don't share their values and their priorities, and aren't fighting for the things that they care about. And so our President John Cowan's warning to Democrats was that we dismiss this issue at our electoral peril. It may not be the top issue like the economy and prices, but nevertheless, some very credible research suggested that it was the number 3 most compelling reason for voters to vote against Harris in this election.
Number 3.
And so we offered a path for Democrats to retake the center that involves meeting voters where they're at. This is a complex conversation. It is evolving in real time. And so Democrats should recognize that there are a lot of Americans that have real and understandable concerns about this question when it comes to safety and fairness in sports, and also when it comes to children and how we navigate medical care for children. Our view is that we need to stand, when it comes to kids, solidly on the side of parents and ensuring that there are no medical decisions made without the full consent and approval of the parent, and that at the level of high school or above, that sports decisions need to be made with an interest in safety and fairness and protecting student athletes, and that those decisions are best made at the local level by associations and not there's not more light coming to this conversation by having federal officials in Congress battle out this issue as they try to score political points. We think that the American people recognize that these are complex conversations. They are compassionate. But we've got to cancel the language police on the Democratic side of the aisle. I think if somebody's heart is in the right place and they're not trying to be offensive or score political points, we want to be welcoming as they navigate these really challenging conversations with us in real time, and make sure that if you're somebody that has concerns about this for personal or religious reasons, that you know that you still have value within the Democratic coalition.
Okay. And somewhat similar, with regard to the homeless or the unhoused, especially in some of our major cities, this seems to be an issue that just really confounds Democratic local officials. Does Third Way have any advice for them?
Well, we don't do housing policy at Third Way, but I will point to this as an example of where a reform-oriented spirit would serve Democrats well. There are a lot of voters that would look to blue states and cities, and they should be an example of the kind of high-quality governance that they can expect from our party. And in too many places, voters feel frustrated that they have long-standing challenges like a persistent homeless population that doesn't have safe and accessible housing available to them. And they're not seeing solutions. And so we need to be thinking creatively about how we meet the needs of this population, how we are ensuring that our public spaces are welcoming for all, and that voters feel like we're able to actually tackle the things that they are telling us they care about. And there are a lot of cities across this country where that is a very pressing issue for voters, and Democrats need to take that seriously.
Mm-hmm. Among your 7, I noted that crime was not seemingly a big concern. Now, is that because most experts believe that the rates of crime, at least for major crimes, have actually decreased post-pandemic? Do you believe that issue has sort of receded in the minds of the voting public?
I don't, and we actually group that as part of the social policy suite of topics. So we do work on crime. That was one of the conversations where there were a lot of voters anxious that Democrats were not fighting hard enough. Obviously, we lived through an era where defund the police was a very common refrain, particularly among the far left. And what we have seen is that a lot of the places that were pursuing some of those policies have actually moved back towards the center. And so this is a space where Democrats need to make clear that we care deeply about safe communities, and we're going to work to solve that problem for voters.
Okay. It is time for another short break, so please stay tuned as we continue to discuss the Third Way approach to both domestic and international issues when we return for another segment of Inside Scoop.
So, I just moved in with this family, and it's embarrassing. The little one, he likes to go outside and crawl around in the giant litter box. I don't know what he's doing. I mean, I was born and I knew how to use the litter box. Look at that. That's disgusting. Oh, poop already. You're making me nervous. Oh, okay, I can't look at this anymore. I really hope he grows out of this, for his sake.
So how was work?
It was 1,300 hours. My math class from 302 was in the trenches. Davy Roth had it the worst. Fractions were coming at him left and right. He just didn't get the damn things. 2 days ago, I tried to teach him what 1/4 of 1/2 was using different sizes of blocks. Yesterday, I tried again by dividing up pizza. Both missions failed.
Oh, no.
But today, I was ready. I created a combat math game where the only way to beat the enemy is to out-fraction them. Davy conquered every last denominator. My game was so successful, the principal is deploying it to math squadrons all over the school. Anywho, how was your day?
Oh, today my boss treated the office to salad wraps.
Salad wraps.
I know.
150 over 90.
180 over 111.
160 over 110. I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure looks like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from invisible or silent. If you've come off your treatment plan, get back on it or talk with your doctor to create an exercise, diet, and medication plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
If I would have followed a treatment plan, I would not be in this situation.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
I'm Russell Brooks with our guest, Kate deGruyter, Senior Director of Communications at Third Way. In our last segment, we talked a little bit about some of the issues that have bedeviled Democrats, especially in the Trump era. Now, in response to some of these difficulties, some of the party luminaries, such as Rahm Emanuel or Senator Lisa Slotkin, have said that the party is viewed by the public as being, quote, weak and woke. Okay? Clearly, that's not attractive to the American people. Is the party weak and woke?
We would agree with those folks that you cited. There is a clear message from voters that Democrats are not aligned with their values and their priorities. And I think that there's work to do to show a more muscular centrism. Voters aren't looking for a squishy middle ground, and that's not what we aim to offer on any particular issue. But they do want reasonableness, and they want results. And so I think that there's a lot of room, and somebody like Senator Alyssa Slotkin is one of those voices who is pushing the party to reconnect with, in particular, working Americans, folks in the heartland where, frankly, the Democratic Party has really cratered in support over the course of my career. We've got a lot of work to do to rebuild our electoral coalition and thinking about how we are in better touch with the views and the concerns, whether it's on education, which is a topic that Rahm Emanuel talks about frequently, on national security, and on economic opportunity for American workers, particularly those who might not have a college degree, are really important areas for the Democratic Party to focus on.
Okay. That is probably easier said than done. I ask because the party's base, be it minority groups, organized labor, environmental communities, some women's groups, are very attached to some of these policies that will be associated with being weak and woke. How does the party overcome that?
Well, I think a lot of those folks would really like to have a winning majority again. And so we've got to make the case that the path forward is to recognize and build where we are strong. And actually, I would point out that a whole lot of those groups are actually really quite moderate. There's a perception that Twitter, I guess now X, is real life. But in fact, the conversations that legislators and elite folks across Washington, D.C. see on that platform are not reflective of certainly the general electorate, but they're also not reflective of a Democratic primary electorate. And that's in part why Joe Biden emerged last time as the nominee in a very crowded primary. He won the center, and it was in particular voters of color in South Carolina and a whole bunch of other states that when they weighed in, they were very clear that it was the moderate that was able to best coalesce and build the winning coalition that Democrats needed.
Mm-hmm. Third Way wants the party to be led by patriotism, persuasion, and pragmatism. So what does that say is driving the current set of office holders and activists in the Democratic Party?
Well, I think that there's a whole disparate universe of groups that are advocating for single issues, and there's been a culture where increasingly on the left you have talk about allyship and a requirement that everybody in your coalition must agree with you on every issue. And that's how you end up with groups like the ACLU offering a questionnaire that included that famous remark from Vice President Harris about her views on transition care for transgender inmates. That wasn't actually a conversation or a questionnaire from a group representing the transgender community. That was from the ACLU. And so you can end up with groups pushing the party into spaces that reflect a very small and elite group of views. And frankly, what we see is that in the Democratic Party, white progressives are the outliers. But they're very loud, and they are very highly representative among folks that staff congressional offices and elite advocacy organizations. And that's all well and good, but we need to make sure that we are keeping our finger on the pulse of the broader American public. Roughly 2/3 of Americans don't have a college degree, and a lot of them feel like we don't understand their lives and their views and their values. And so we've got to really have some tough conversations to make sure that Democrats are thinking about how we reconnect with those voters, how we show them that we respect them, that we understand that they're not looking for a handout, but that they want opportunity and dignity as they go about their work, and that we're offering them paths to do so that are going to give them actual results.
Okay. Speaking about that segment of the American public, as you rightly said, Democrats lost the support of the working class in the last presidential election. Bernie Sanders says this quite loudly, quite often, but so has Governor Tim Walz and others. How can the Democrats get them back?
Well, I think part of it is going to be going into a lot of different communities and having honest and frank conversations. We can't be just talking to our base. We need to be expanding the map. When you look at how Democrats win elections, the states that Kamala Harris was hoping would get her to 270 electoral votes in 2032 are not going to be worth enough electoral votes to get you there. You're going to have to win states that were more red and more friendly to the Republican Party. And so that means that we're going to have to open up the aperture and figure out how to win in some tougher states. So there's work to be done there. Bernie Sanders has approached championing democratic socialism. We are not confident that that's the path forward, and frankly, we are often in a different place about how Democrats should be positioned on the economy. At this moment, I think the answer to Trump from the populist left would be to focus a lot of the conversation on robber barons and big companies. I've heard that language come out of some folks on the left in our party. And at a moment where Donald Trump's economic plan is driving up costs, is making it impossible for businesses to make decisions. We're hearing stories from Walmart and small retailers that they simply can't make the math add up. And so is the message that Democrats want to say that is Donald Trump's fault, or is the message that that's the corporation's fault? I think we would be on better footing politically to make sure that we are ensuring voters know that this is the policy that Donald Trump and the Republican Party is offering that is driving up costs, and that we need to keep that message focused. What we see is that voters have a bit of a curiosity about folks that are successful and wealthy. And I mentioned Senator Ruben Gallego earlier, and he notes that a lot of the guys driving around Arizona aspire to have a big truck and to be wealthy, and that's the American dream. And so we want people who have done really well to pay their fair share. That's something that's shared within the Democratic coalition. That's an appropriate conversation, but we shouldn't be begrudging wealth and hustle and success of the American dream.
So speaking of that desire to reward hustle, I noticed that Third Way advocates an opportunity economy as maybe a means of attracting the working class that Democrats have lost in recent years. Could you describe this opportunity economy and how it will benefit those who have forsaken the Democratic Party?
Yeah, we've been obsessed about how the party has been hemorrhaging non-college workers for some time. And so our economic team has been putting together reports noting just how different the economic livelihood is of somebody who has a college degree and somebody who doesn't. You see huge differences in savings, in retirement savings that they might have to have a secure and dignified retirement. So how can we rethink wealth building for folks? What does it look like to have a guaranteed retirement account where folks can be contributing? Pensions are no longer in vogue. So how are we helping people prepare and have funds that are growing in a way that leaves them in a strong position to enjoy their senior years with confidence? Mm-hmm. We have some ideas on that front. Apprenticeships are a really important opportunity to access the middle class, to learn and to build training as you are gathering your skills. We need to do a much better job of connecting the training and education system in America with the needs of employers and equipping folks for the kinds of high-skilled jobs that our economy is going to need. Technology is changing at a rapid pace. We need folks who are prepared for a whole bunch of skilled trades. And so there's a lot of work to be done revamping the education system. I talked to my grandfather, and he had his career in the phone company, and his story is about how the phone company sent him back at multiple points throughout his career to get the training and skills to advance. How are we creating that culture where workers are able to grow, to build their skills, not just at the start of their career, but throughout the career to make sure that they can reach the levels that they want to go? There's a lot of work to be done.
Sure. Would that opportunity economy help the party as well reintroduce itself to maybe some of the members of minority groups that have also declined in their fidelity to the Democratic Party? One has to note that Trump made noticeable gains among both African Americans and Latinos in the most recent election. Is that something that can be addressed via this opportunity economy?
Yeah, and I think it's part of sort of the broader orientation of the party. What we see is a real entrepreneurial spirit among many of these populations, and that is the path to the middle class. Small businesses are job creators, so how are we equipping folks who have an idea or an innovation to get the capital that they need, to get the relationships and the loans that they need to be able to have a successful business where they can hire folks and actually grow and scale? There's a lot of work to be done, and frankly, the message from the Democratic Party too often is seen as anti-business. And there are a lot of folks in the Black and the Latino communities who are very proud and enterprising entrepreneurs, and we need to be building that. It's a huge part of wealth creation, and we see, a very persistent gap in how those communities have been able to build wealth. Equipping them to be employers should be something that the Democratic Party is championing, and we've got a lot we could do in that space.
I guess your earlier example of how the party maybe didn't listen to border communities is maybe a perfect example of that lack of willingness to listen. Well, I hear the music, so once again, we must take a short break, and then we will continue tonight's very interesting discussion. We will return with a bit more with Kate deGruyter as we talk more about Third Way on Inside Scoop. Really loving the conversation here.
You made your house a reality. Homeschooling yourself on loans, color-coding listings, and flushing every toilet in a 20-mile radius. If you can ace house hunting, you can do it for retirement. Get on track with tips at aceyourretirement.org.
Here's to the things that can keep us safe. Those we use all the time with hardly a thought. Those that are silently standing by to save our lives. And now, those that we carry with us everywhere we go. Many mobile devices will now bring you wireless emergency alerts, real-time information directly from local sources you know and trust. With the unique sound and vibration, you'll be in the know.
Listen, I realize that I'm not perfect, but it all really started to change because you judge me for having a problem. No one is going to know that I need help. I need help. I know that no one is going to judge me for having a problem. I realize that I'm not perfect, but it all really started to change because you listen.
Family. Whether it's a short trip or a long haul.
Estimated time, 47 hours.
They will beg.
You're hungry? I'm happy to provide.
They will plead.
Deep fried butter on a stick.
But whatever you do, don't wimp out.
Now you're talking.
Make them buckle up.
He can't hurt.
Remember, safety first. cheese curls. Second.
Are you orange?
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. Let's continue with Kate deGruyter of Third Way. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, but I would be remiss if I didn't raise the Jake Tapper, Alex Thompson book, Original Sin. As we know, the thrust of the book is that the Democratic Party and senior White House officials let down the American people by not being more forthcoming about President Biden's physical and cognitive decline. And they would contend that the party and the American people are now paying the price for that error. Even if you haven't read the book, what do you think of the argument?
I understand why they want to make that argument, but I think it is just a fundamental misunderstanding of where we are at in this country. The voters made very clear over a long time that they had deep misgivings about President Biden's ability to do what, by all accounts, is a very strenuous and difficult job. And while he may be able to navigate a lot of those policy issues on a day-to-day basis, as they claim, at a minimum, he wasn't able to do the kind of retail politicking and aggressive outreach that modern politics require. And I think it is a valuable opportunity at this moment for Democrats to take a fresh step forward. There will be no more Bidens or Obamas or Clintons running on the Democratic ticket. I think voters are looking to the future and they want to see candidates that can speak to a new generation. So I think it's time to turn the page. I think we have to recognize that an insular team did us no favors by what appears to be hiding some of the president's challenges from the public. I think there are a lot of folks that assumed that things were going better behind the scenes and did so on good faith. But it's clear that we missed that moment, and Democrats going forward are going to have a clear answer to show voters that we hear them and that we are going to take those concerns seriously. And, you know, I would like to see a new generation of leaders who reflect the kinds of things that modern two-parent working households are grappling with, thinking about how we navigate a digital age, and somebody who can really be a leader in that conversation. I think that there's some potential talent. There's a whole deep bench of folks running, and that's a positive thing for the party.
Mm-hmm. Should the party express a bit of remorse for how Dean Phillips was treated? It appears he was the only one, the former congressman was the only one who was willing to speak truth to power.
I have to give him credit, and in fact, I'm actually from his district. I grew up in Minnesota's 3rd congressional district, and yeah, Dean Phillips was right, and I was one of the people that was not positive on the prospects for his campaign. As it turns out, we weren't wrong about that, but the substance of his critique was on point. Democrats did need to grapple with the president's age and the sense of the American public that it would be better to have somebody in the job who was more at the height of their career. So yeah, I think that there's value in having more candid conversations, and we're going to have to do more of that going forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, you spoke about that deep bench that the Democrats have, and I think we're seeing some evidence of members of that bench dipping their toes into the presidential campaign waters. One, would you agree? I'm speaking of people like Governor Pritzker, Governor Moore, Governor Beshear, Pete Buttigieg. I can go on and on.
Yeah.
Is it too early for such machinations?
No, I don't think it is. I don't think that we're going to see folks declare for some time. There's a whole bunch of reasons why it's probably not in their interest to formally declare, but the people are hungry for leadership, and there's an opportunity for folks who would like to lead this nation to start showing that they've got that gumption. So I think it is important that we are getting some of our most talented leaders and communicators out deployed across the country, talking to voters in key states, going on podcasts and having conversations with a whole bunch of different groups of people to really make clear what we stand for, to show that we are fighting for the things that they care about, and road testing the ideas and arguments that they think might be a part of their pitch to voters. There's going to be a whole conversation within the Democratic Party about what that agenda ought to look like. We're doing some deep thinking about that, but certainly we're not alone. But it's also going to have to dovetail with the personal story and the vision that the candidate lays out. And so, the process of running for president is grueling. There have been lots of examples of people that were seen as incredible talents who struggled to meet the moment. We saw, most notably Governor DeSantis was one who was highly discussed on the Republican side of the aisle and just frankly fizzled out at best. There's an opportunity for our folks to really build their chops, to develop some of the retail skills that show and help them connect with voters. And I and lots of folks are going to be watching very closely.
Okay. So among these potential candidates, who's appealing from a third way standpoint? You've spoken highly about Governor Moore already, but who else out there is appealing?
Well, I mentioned Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro is one who's been a part of that mix. I think Andy Beshear from Kentucky is an interesting profile, a red state, which is not something that we've seen recently. Pete Buttigieg is a very talented communicator and somebody who has definitely been able to go into Fox News and a whole bunch of other places and talk and relate to people in a really interesting way. And, there are a whole bunch of other senators that are trying to make their moment. We'll see if somebody like Raphael Warnock decides to run. Certainly Cory Booker found a moment recently with his speech on the floor of the Senate. I would say we're looking for somebody who can excite the people, but also unite and build out from the center. And so Democratic campaigns are one in the middle. In key battleground states, you have to win a supermajority of moderate voters. And a lot of those moderates are deep parts of the Democratic primary. And so our encouragement to all of these candidates is to think very carefully about how they might be tempted to get pulled outside of the mainstream on issues. We saw the transgender issue with Vice President Harris ended up proving pretty toxic. That was from a survey she filled out in 2019. And so they need to think carefully about where they might be getting poor advice or taking positions that they need to think about how they're going to address, and thinking about how they are appealing to the diverse coalition that we are going to have to win outside of Washington.
Mm-hmm. Is there anyone who so far isn't making any moves in that direction that maybe should?
I think it's impossible to know. At this early stage of the campaign, nobody had heard of Barack Obama, so it is impossible to know who might come on the scene and really catch fire in an incredible way. I think somebody outside of Washington is going to have a good shot at that. Obviously, coming off voter frustration with the president's age, and anybody tied to the Biden administration is going to have some questions about how they navigated that conversation. But there's a real hunger for change. Vice President Harris was seen as a continuation of a status quo that, frankly, voters weren't that happy with. And she simply wasn't able to distinguish herself from the administration's record. Somebody who isn't from Washington will have an easier job being that fresh face and showing that they are unconnected to the things that voters are frustrated with, and we'll have to keep an eye out for somebody who fits that bill.
It sounds like you're suggesting the Vice President Harris should maybe run for governor and establish her own bona fides before thinking about the presidency again?
I think we'll have to see. I mean, if she chooses to run, I think it's clear that she would be a presumptive leader in that field. She has very high standing within the party. But at a moment when Democrats are having to retake the center, embracing, a California liberal is going to require some real tough work. And so there's a challenging path to the nomination. I think there's a lot that she has to think through. We'll see where she decides that she sees her future in the coming, weeks and months.
Mm-hmm. One thing seems abundantly clear in all the polls among the Democratic electorate. they're looking for a fighter. They want someone who's going to fight the Republicans, going to fight President Trump. Is that the message that Third Way is receiving as well? Because presumably, if Democrats take back the House, if Democrats who are thinking about running for president actually declare, the public's looking for that sort of fighting spirit. Would you agree?
I would say yes, but with a caveat, which is that we need to be seen fighting for the things that voters care most about. So fighting for the sake of scoring political points, if it's in service of taking back the House, obviously Democrats are looking for any lever to retake power in Washington and be able to influence the policies coming out of the administration. But there's a temptation to embrace a whole bunch of issues that are deeply important, but that frankly are just not resonant with the broader public. And it would be important and strategic for Democrats to think about how we show fight on the economy, on reducing costs, on securing the border and having a fair and orderly system as voters were looking for, and in a way that is not opening up America to the kinds of cruelty and excesses that we're seeing and how the Trump administration is pursuing that.
I have to ask, what are those issues that are not so important for Democrats?
It pains me to say this, but I think, pro-democracy issues were the thing that the Harris campaign ended on as part of their closing argument to voters. And I think broadly, the agreement is that that was a missed opportunity because the thing that voters cared most about was on the economy. It is a painful irony that the best way to save democracy is not to talk about it. Wow. But unfortunately, that is where we're at in this moment. And there are a whole bunch of things that Democrats can and should be doing. The Congress can and should be providing robust oversight. There's a whole lot of work that they can be doing. But the message that we need to be fighting every day to get in front of voters is how we are fighting to make their lives better. And, vague arguments about democracy, as much as I wish that was resonant and deeply inspiring to the voters, are simply less effective than having a strong economic message and meeting them where they're at on some of these culture issues.
One last question that'll have to be fairly quick. What's the message you're taking from the protests that we're seeing nationwide and we're certainly going to see on June 14th and to coincide with the president's birthday parade?
I think that there's an opportunity for Democrats to show what patriotism really looks like. I was pleased to see how the vice president embraced some of those patriotic messages part of our campaign. I think we need to do more of that, but having a big military parade to fawn over the president is probably not the best way to do it.
Well, let me thank Kate for a really fascinating show, and let me thank the audience for watching our program again. So stay tuned next week when we come back for another edition of Inside Scoop.